Not sure if folks can hear Mike. I feel like he may have vanished momentarily. Okay,
Prompt.
well, I
I
will
did
keep
correct my
Oh, he's
audio
back.
system. I'm back on.
Okay.
Here I am. Thank you. So welcome everyone to today's webinar. Our topic is ATE Central's Plan, Organize, Submit, a look at ATE Central's archiving process. I'm your host for today's webinar, Mike Lasecki. This event will be recorded. It's my pleasure to introduce the first of today's presenters to you, my colleague Rachael Bauer. She's the PI of ATE Central, and ATE Central is headquartered at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Rachael, would you take us forward and please introduce your colleague?
Absolutely. Well, I'm thrilled, as always, to be working with Kendra Bouda, who is also at UW-Madison at Internet Scout, our umbrella research center, and home to AT Central. Kendra, do you want to just say a quick hello?
Hello?
Hi, do you want to just
Can
say a
everyone?
quick hello, Kendra?
Oh, I'm sorry. Hi, everyone. My name's Kendra Bouda, like Rachel just mentioned, and I'm Metadata and Information Specialist with ATE Central. I'm responsible for the ATE Central Resource Portal and the archiving service here, and I also serve as a direct contact for the ATE community.
All right. I'm going to, now that we've sort of briefly introduced ourselves, we want to introduce the goals of today's webinar. Kendra, do you want to go through these?
Sure. So our goal today is to answer these 4 questions. Firstly, what does ATE Central archive? We'll take a brief look at the NSF ATE archiving requirement, talk a bit about what types of material ATE Central collects, the file formats we recommend, and then we'll touch on the 3 types of intellectual property licenses that NSF encourages grant recipients to use. Next, we'll talk about how you would go about archiving your materials with us. We'll look at what happens after you submit your work to ATE Central. And finally, to wrap up, we'll look at how you can use the ATE Central Resource Portal to find ATE materials to adapt and to use for your own purposes. So Rachel's going to start us off by talking a bit about ATE Central and the tools and services that ATE Central offers. But first, I believe we have a poll question.
Yes, we do. So we always like to know who is on the call with us. Mike's going to open that poll up, and you can just click on those little buttons that you see on your screen and let us know who you are. So we want to know if you're affiliated with an AT grant that was funded 2015 or later, funded 2014 or earlier. Maybe you're not currently funded, but you're writing an AT grant, so you're interested in learning more about archiving because you're in the process of grant writing, or other. And if you click on other, we'd love for you to put in the chat window what your situation is, because we're always curious to know what folks are up to and how they why they're so interested in this topic that we of course are very interested in at AT Central of archiving. So most folks, it looks like, Kendra, are in the situation of being funded. They received funding in 2015 or later, which isn't terribly surprising. It's 3 years ago, so not a lot of folks from 2014. And let's see. Oh, there's an evaluator on. That's always great. We love it when evaluators join us to learn more about archiving. Oh, and it looks like Laura's audio thing got straightened out too. Yay. Sometimes you just have to log out and log back in. It's the way the audio works. All right, so we've got one person who it looks like, okay, there we go. We have one person who is not currently funded but was writing a grant, and we have a couple people who are from those earlier, funded through or an earlier solicitation. All right, thanks, Mike. I think we can close that up. Okay. So just briefly, we want to remind you a little bit about who we are at AT Central. AT Central's primary purpose is really to amplify the impact of the ATE community. And by that we mean that we want to help everyone in the community do the things that they want to do, strengthen the program as a whole as much as we can. We do that through a bunch of services and tools and through our main information hub and portal. So one of the things that we do is we collect data about the resources that everybody in the community is creating through their grant funding. So for many grantees, one of their deliverables, surprisingly, might be curriculum, it might be other kinds of materials that they're developing. And for the most part, in our resource collection, we link to those. We create metadata around that resource. We create a record that points to that resource on your own website. But we are also tasked with acting as an archive for the community. And that means that we actually have a copy of that resource on our own servers. And somebody just asked if it costs anything to archive, and it does not. That's covered by our funding at AT Central. So it's free to you. It's funded by NSF. It's free to projects and centers. The archiving support really came about in response to community need. If you think about it, for many folks in the community, thinking about these big issues like sustainability and data management planning, they're really critical issues for all of us in the AT community. NSF asks folks to file a data management plan when they write their grant, to talk about how they're going to sustain the work that they're doing, the data that they collect over the long haul. They've also implemented an archiving requirement for ATE. So in both instances, both at the larger NSF level, in particular at the AT programmatic level, there's this deep interest in ensuring that people have access to your data and your deliverables after funding sunsets. And so this archiving support came about in response to that need from the community, and the support takes the form of guidelines, things like the checklist that you see over on the right-hand side. You can download that at any point and take a look at that. And the webinar today is another example of how we provide support. So I'm going to turn this over to Kendra, and she is going to get into the meat and potatoes of our webinar today, and we'll be taking questions all throughout the webinar. We'll have some particular points where you can ask a question. We'll stop, but anytime you'd like to ask a question, just drop it into that chat window, and I'll make sure that Kendra and I get to it at appropriate moments as we can. So Kendra, I'm going to turn it over to you.
I'd like to start off today by talking a little bit about what the AT Central Archive is and what we do here. So Rachel's already touched briefly on it, and I want to go into a little bit more detail. For those of you who may have already participated in one of our Basics of Archiving webinars or sessions before, the next 2 or 3 slides will look pretty familiar to you. So the ATE Central Archive is a virtual space where the deliverables and select administrative documents created by the ATE community are collected, stored, and made available in a digital format. So you'll note here that the word stored is highlighted. Storing resources on ATE Central servers is largely what differentiates archived resources from those other linked resources that Rachel touched on briefly in the AT Central Resource Portal. So let's look at an example to illustrate these differences. So here's an example of an AT Central resource record, or metadata record is another common name for it. The resource record or metadata record simply contains information that describes a resource. It could be a Word document, a video recording, audio, and in this example we have a PDF. This resource describes, or this resource record describes a resource in the same way that sort of your typical library record might describe a book or a DVD. So we have a title, a description, and a URL. And I'm turning this little pointer on here. So those are up here. Then we have some information about the creator and the publisher, some subject terms describing what the resource is, and some other data such as the resource type, format, the intended audience, and so on. Now, because this is an archived resource, there's also this attachment, an associated file that's circled here in red. So this file is stored on our servers here at AT Central, and it will remain available long term even if Evaluate were to remove this page from their website for some reason. So if this particular resource weren't archived, there would be a URL to the resource on someone else's website, which we have here linking to the Evaluate website, but there would be no associated file attached to that resource. And so if that URL were to disappear for any reason, we would no longer have access to it and would have to remove this resource from our collection. You'll also note that here on the right is this little archived with AT Central logo, which is the easiest way for you to distinguish archived resources from those that we simply link to. So before I go on and talk more about the archiving requirement, are there any general questions about what the archive is or what an archive resource looks like?
It looks like we do have one question. Someone's asking, there are two people have asked two different things. One is, what's the benefit of archiving? And then another person has asked, I'm a PI, can I delegate this to our project manager? Does she need any specific skills?
Okay, so let's start with the first question. So there's a variety of benefits to archiving with AT Central. The first of which is that it may help fulfill a data management requirement that you wrote into your data management plan. Because this resource will remain available after a project or center funding ends. Often after a project or center funding sunsets, the website usually goes away eventually and those resources might not be readily available. So in this way, they can remain online regardless of what happens to the project or center moving forward. It's also a great dissemination tool because we can reach audiences beyond the audiences that you already reach. So because we're a centralized archive and we collect all the material from the ATE community, that means that someone who's interested in ATE, interested in STEM in general, can search our collection and find those materials in one centralized place rather than having to go to individual project and center pages to find the materials that they're looking for. So there's a variety of benefits up front. Rachel, did you have any other thoughts in terms of the benefit question?
Yeah, I think those are both really great points, Kendra. And I think the other thing that people can sort of think about, I mean, this is a requirement by NSF, the AT program, and specifically, so you're fulfilling the requirement by archiving, and that's reportable, something you can report to NSF. But I think you can also, I think that Kendra's point about, potentially broadening your audiences is a really good one. So, it means that it's another way to disseminate your material. It helps fulfill your dissemination plan, and it helps potentially broaden your impact because everybody has different audiences. We have a slightly different group of audiences that may come to AT Central than may come to your specific project website. And so this is a way to broaden participation, broaden dissemination for you.
Great, thank you. And the second question was about delegating this to a project manager. The answer is yes. So anyone can submit materials to the archive. We'll be looking at the archive submission form later on in the presentation. In order to use that form, you simply have to have an AT Central login or an account, which are free and easy to set up, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And The form itself is meant to be pretty simple and straightforward, so anyone can use it, and that person does not require any specialized skills. And after submitting process, the submission process, we will also be in contact with the submitter and asking questions and helping along the way. So if there's any hiccups, we help to address those on a case-by-case basis. So really, no specific skills necessary. Okay, so I will move on then to the next slide, and feel free to continue asking your questions in chat. So next we're going to look at the NSF requirement. According to the NSF ATE RFP, new grantees who apply for and are awarded funding under either Solicitation 14577 or 17568, and it sounds like most of you have received funding under 17568, you're required to archive your deliverables with the ATE eCentral resource portal. So these deliverables are to be in a digital and archivable format with any intellectual property information clearly displayed. So once again, we have some highlights here, and we're going to look at these individually. Deliverables of any project or center will be described in your original grant proposal, though that may evolve over time, and that's perfectly fine. But generally speaking, deliverables are usually relatively easy to identify, and we can also help you identify those should you like some assistance with that. Most of the materials we collect fall into one of the first 4 categories listed here. So assessment, instructional, reference, and professional development materials. Assessment materials might include tests, answer keys, grading rubrics, that kind of thing. Instruction materials covers a very wide variety of content like activities, case studies, lesson plans, textbooks, labs, tutorials, games, simulations. Reference materials applies to articles, reports, and career information. And then finally, professional development materials often include presentation, workshop materials, and video recordings. We also collect what we just call samples. So samples of materials you created, like manuals or guides, best practices, survey tools, things that you think would be valuable to the AT community as a whole. And then finally, we do collect select administrative documents. These are materials that are meant to document the success of your project or center, things like data sets that, and this material doesn't necessarily have to be publicly available though. We can archive it for internal purposes and not distribute this kind of material widely. We archive materials that are available in digital and archivable formats. Not all deliverables are digital or even necessarily tangible in nature. So perhaps you're funded to organize a student competition or a conference, something along those lines. Neither is inherently digital, but you may very well create support material that are available in a digital format, such as handouts or PowerPoint presentations. Those things we do archive. What we consider to be an archivable format is outlined in our archiving service policy at atcentral.net/archiving. And I've taken a screenshot here of the general type of formats and file sizes that we accept. Please, though, if you have other formats or larger files, feel free to contact me about those. I know that many of you use specialized software or produce content in some type of field-specific file format, and we're definitely happy to review those. So just generally speaking, if you create audio, video, visual, textual, or course material in an LMS, these are sort of the file formats that we just recommend. And then finally, there's that intellectual property piece. So under the RFP, grantees are encouraged to make their materials available under a Creative Commons license. And specifically, NSF encourages the use of attribution share alike, and attribution non-commercial share alike licenses. All of these licenses allow users to copy, distribute, transmit, and generally adapt copyrighted work to varying degrees, as long as you attribute and share the work in the manner that is specified in the license. If you do choose to use a CC license, then it must be affixed to the work itself. So I'll just pass this over to Rachael.
All right, so we have a second poll. We just want to learn a little bit kind of where you are at this point in your archiving journey. So are you just beginning to think about archiving, kind of looking for information? Perhaps that's why you came to the webinar today. You're kind of a little farther along. Maybe you're really planning to archive with us within the next year. You feel like you're ready to go and excited to get started with your archiving, or other. Again, feel free. I know somebody was working on a grant, so maybe that's why you're interested, and you're just trying to think about how to include language in your grant related to archiving. So lots of folks in those first two categories. One person in the ready to go. Lots of folks in the just beginning to think about it and in the planning.
Yes, well, I'm glad to see that so many of you seem to be planning to archive within the next year here. That's very exciting.
Yeah, that's exciting to see. All right, Mike, thanks so much. I think we can take that one down. Move along.
Okay, so the next few slides here talk about the submission process itself, specifically how you would submit materials to the ATE Central resource portal using the archive submission form. If you do have a large quantity of materials, I'll say this up front, don't feel obligated to use this form. We can always work with you directly, so feel free to contact me, and we can explore some other submission options like Dropbox or Google Folders, or just some other way to get large quantities of materials to us. So to submit your materials for archiving, you do need to be logged in to your AT Central account. If you don't yet have one, simply click on the Sign in the upper right-hand corner here. And then on the Get an Account link in the middle of the screen to create a new account. If you're interested in learning why creating an account can be beneficial other than archiving, there's a little link here called Why Login, and you can read about all the other benefits of AT Central login. Once logged in, you can find the archive submission form at atcentral.net/archiving/submissions, which is listed here for you, or you can just access the form under the Resources tab, located here in the main navigation. The drop-down has a link to our archiving services page, and then everything that I'm talking about today is linked to that page in some way. So to begin your submission, you would then click this Create New Submission button circled in red. The next three slides are examples of different types of submissions, and I'd like to spend some time looking through each of these in a little more detail. The first is the most basic kind of submission. It's an individual file. So in this example, we have a Word document, but it could be a PDF or an MP3 or MP4 file. When submitting, or any other file format for that matter, when submitting a deliverable using the archive submission form, you can only upload a single file, and it may not exceed 1 gigabyte. So required fields are identified on the form by the yellow circle around the field name, which includes associated file, which is where you would upload your document, award number, a contact name and email, and then you must agree to the terms listed here, which acknowledge that you are either the copyright holders of the material or that you're an authorized representative of the copyright holder, and that we may use, copy, migrate, or modify your materials for preservation and archiving purposes. You're also asked to verify that we may distribute your materials freely. So if you're submitting materials that you don't want made publicly available, things like answer keys, for example, I'd recommend that you contact us directly rather than using the submission form, because you do need to agree to the terms in order to submit the form. All other information on this form is optional, including that description field, where you're really welcome to add anything that you like, such as a brief summary or description of the submission, maybe some information about when and how the material was created. If it was a presentation, you could provide conference or speaker information, really anything that you deem important. I should note that we do edit this description field, so it's not, your comments are not going to be published in the form that you enter them here. So feel free to use that description field for anything that you like. You can also suggest an ATE area and check the little licensing box at the bottom if you're interested in receiving a very general email with some basic information about licensing and Creative Commons licenses. So that one was pretty straightforward. You can submit this form as many times as you like. So if you have multiple reports, for example, you can submit the form multiple times, one submission per report. The next example is a submission of related resources. So let's say that you submit, or you want to submit, all of the materials related to a particular module. You can still only upload one file, but you can feel free to drop all of your related materials into a single zip file, compress that file, and then upload the zip. In this example, you'll note that the submitter has used a consistent method for naming her files. It's clear to anyone who's opening the zip file that the zip contains, or it's clear what it contains. And the description here also provides some context for AT Central staff to help us understand what it is that we're looking at. So this example is pretty similar to the second one, the one that we just looked at. It's really the one that I want to take a closer look at. It's just a bit more complicated than our previous example. So here we have, let's turn our little pointer back on, our single zip file that contains all the materials used for an entire academic course. And in our example, we're calling this course GIS 101. The description tells us who taught the course, where it was taught, what program it was for, that it's a required course, and that the course is divided into 8 modules. Then looking at the field name, the file names, we can see that this course was taught in the fall of 2013, and we have both the syllabus and the course schedule. The main folder structure shows that the zip contains exams, modules, and something about research projects. In the modules folder, we see those 8 modules that are indicated in the description. And in each module, we have some sort of introductory material, an activity, lecture notes, and some other materials. So even just a cursory look at the description and the file names already provides a lot of information about the course. The file names, they're clear, they're consistent, they're really easy to navigate, and not just by our staff, but by anyone who might want to use these materials. So I bring this example up because when you're organizing and naming your files, it's really helpful to think about how someone who is not familiar with your project or center would navigate the folder structure, and this can help you come up with really good, clear file names or folder and subfolder structure. As a side note here, this sample course was submitted as a zip file, which is fine. A few slides ago when I was talking about the acceptable formats, we also accept course content as IMSCC files, which is the file format that some LMS will export your resources as. So for those of you who are PIs or who have selected an authorized contact as a contact for ATE Central, you're probably familiar with our activity reports. These reports go out each quarter to communicate what data ATE Central maintains about your project or center and how our data about you is being used. This example is a snippet from one of Evaluate's recent activity reports. You can see here that we, at the time of this report, had 43 resource records for Evaluate. 35 of those have already been archived. And in the 3-month period displayed here, those 43 records were viewed approximately 500 times, with the 5 most frequently viewed records listed here, called most popular. So of the 8 resource records that we have on file for Evaluate that were not archived, there's only one that our data suggests ought to be considered for archiving, and it's called Principal Investigator To-Do Checklist. New to our activity reports is this little archive button over here to the right. It's rather small. If you were to click on that, it would take you to the archive submission form, and that form would already be pre-populated with everything we know about this particular resource, so the title, the URL, the description, all of that information. And then all the PI or the authorized contact would then need to do is upload a copy of the file to the form, accept the terms, and submit. So this is another way that we're prompting you to submit your materials for archiving and really trying to make it as easy as possible for you so that you don't even have to fill out that form in its entirety. Once your materials have been submitted, a table will appear on the archive submission page. So we looked at this page a little earlier on. You can access anything you've already submitted, and you can check on the status of your submission here. And you can even edit your submission as long as the submission status still says unreviewed. So this third example here, GIS 101, submission status is unreviewed. And as you can see, it's the only submission that still has an edit button. What we're going to do next is remove our little pointer. If we were to click on this image interpretation lab, the first submission here, as you can see, the submission status is not unreviewed, which means we know this resource is no longer editable, but you can still access it and look at it at any time as you submit more and more materials. This list will just get longer and provide information to you about what you've submitted. But after we've changed the submission status to something other than unreviewed, the submission form will then look like this. So as you can see, these fields are no longer editable. You can still read what you submitted, but you won't be able to change it. There is, however, a new link in this submission form. It's circled here in red. It's called the Associated Resource field. So once we've processed your material, this link will appear in your submission, and it links to the resource record that we created for your submission. So you can click on that. It will take you to the ATE Central Resource Portal, and you'll be able to review the material that we've made publicly available for others to see. It's really an easy way to find all of the resources you've submitted, review them, and keep track of your submissions. So before I move on to talk about what happens after you hit that add button, I think we'll pause here for a bit and see if there are any questions.
You know, we do have a couple of questions, Kendra, that have come in. The first one, Lila actually asked, she was saying that it's sort of a complicated situation in that she has an academic course she wants to submit, but it seems to be a bit riddled with copyrighted material from her faculty who developed it. And how does that get handled by us if there's, her material and then a bunch of, let's say, film clips or other things that are actually copyrighted? How do we deal with that at AT Central for someone who's
Yeah,
got
it's
a
actually
situation like
quite
that?
common. Most of the course materials that we look at contain some sort of copyrighted material. And so generally what happens if you submit something that has copyrighted material in it, our catalogers look through all of those resources and try to identify the materials that they know to be questionable. So if there's a New York Times article in there or some type of video content that was clearly created by someone else, we identify those materials and then we'll ask you to what you would like to do with them. And in most cases, what people choose to do is to remove the material and create a bibliography that basically lists any and all material, copyrighted material that was removed and contains links to where that material could be found. So we're trying to preserve the structure of the class as much as possible without actually duplicating those materials. Now, some people do choose just to remove materials that they feel like aren't necessarily as important for the course, or if there's a textbook that's used in the course and those materials are strongly linked to the textbook, the faculty member might be satisfied with having the text listed in the syllabus and not necessarily including all those additional exercises or materials that were duplicated out of the book. But we do work with you to help identify those materials and find a solution that works for you.
In some ways, it always seems to me like that bibliography is such a nice idea because it means if someone wants to adapt your material, it gives them a really quick way to say, ooh, here are the things, let's say it was done 3 years ago. Here's a list of things that I might want to go through, look at, and then potentially update depending on what they are, because there may be newer articles or newer information that could be subbed in that could be useful. It seems like a nice way to do it. It's a little bit of work, obviously, but boy, it makes it much nicer for somebody who's trying to adapt it, I think. So we have one other question. Somebody just chatted me privately and said, when is the best time to archive? Should they wait till right at the end, or should they sort of be working with us and sort of archiving as they go along? What do you think about that one,
It really
Kendra?
depends on your project and center and what kind of work you do and what your preferences are. For some people, submitting as you go makes a lot of sense. So if you've been funded to create a certain number of courses, some people may submit those very clear deliverables, very clear segments as they complete them. For others, it's not quite as straightforward. Maybe you're constantly updating and changing materials and you're concerned that it would get really confusing very quickly if you tried to start submitting somewhere mid-process, and that's fine. We can accept those later on. And for some people, it really doesn't make any sense at all to submit during their project, and that's often the case if you're creating some type of report or large end product that's not going to be complete until the end of your funding, and that's perfectly okay. So if you have any specific questions about your project, your center, the work that you're doing, and would like to come up with a plan, we're happy to work with you on that individually.
Okay, that's all we've got in terms of questions. I think we can move
Great.
forward.
Okay, so we have two flowcharts today that describe the archiving process. The first is the workflow in terms of the resource record itself, how it's created, how it's published and reviewed. And then second, and perhaps more important for our purposes, is the communication process around archiving. So both flowcharts really show the same thing, but they're just looking at the process from a different perspective. And they're both divided into three stages: submission, processing, and review. So let's start with the first flow chart here. So a file is submitted to AT Central either via that submission to AT Central, either via that submission form that we've been looking at or through Dropbox, email, Google folders, something along those lines. Then either a new resource record is created, or if we already know a little bit about that resource, an existing resource record is amended by AT Central staff. The resource record is archived, which we'll take a look at in just a moment here, and then published. The submitter is presented here twice, first in red during the submission process, and then again in blue when he or she is asked to review that newly archived resource, and our staff will then edit that resource in any way that seems to make sense. So during the archiving process, here's what actually happens. So our staff adds a lot of metadata to our records describing what the materials are. And this data really makes it possible for others to find the materials they need either through keyword searches or advanced search, and we'll look at that a little later on, but adding all this data makes the resource more discoverable. So we add a title to every resource. If the material is available online on your websites, we'll add a URL. And then we have the associated files. So because these are archived resources, they do have to have files, but they do not have to have URLs. The URLs are nice as long as the website's available, but those can be removed if the website goes away for any reason. Then we add something that we call series and relation data. So let's say you've created curriculum for a number of different courses in the same certificate program. What we would want to do is preserve the relationship so that anyone who looks at a resource and says, I'm really interested in this curriculum, will have an avenue to find other courses that are taught in that same certificate program and link those records together in some way that is very clear and helpful to the user. We add data about the creator and the publisher, a description field that outlines what is available in the associated file field. This can be really brief. If it's a single PDF, we might just have a short paragraph describing what that PDF is. Or if it's an entire academic course, this could be a rather extensive description highlighting all the materials that have been placed into a single zip file. We add quite a bit of subject vocabularies, dates if appropriate. Reports, for example, tend to have a publication date. We talk about the resource type in the data. That's where we identify if something's assessment material, if it's instructional, and if it's instructional, what kind of material it is. Is it a lesson plan? Is it a lab? Is it an activity? The format will help users find video recordings or different types of formatted materials depending on what they're looking for. And then, of course, the languages that the material is available in. Next, we try to identify who the intended audience is, and we also have a field called audience refinement. We added this because we've noticed that a number of projects and centers really focus on serving a particular community or a certain audience. For example, your project might be focused on service members and veterans, perhaps adult learners or women. So we have a small vocabulary that helps us identify if a particular audience group is highlighted in the materials. We identify the education level, and we may or may not add some information about pedagogy. So if this is curriculum that we're talking about, and there's a very clear instructional method employed, let's say it's a flipped classroom, curriculum for a flipped classroom, or it's project-based learning, we will add data about that. Then we add any information that we have about rights, access rights, and content licenses, and a screenshot. So this is pretty much the data that you see, but we add a lot more data to the records that help drive things like our activity reports, our fact sheets, information throughout our website, and helps with our workflow as we process your materials. So that's pretty much what happens behind the scenes after you've submitted. So here's the communication process, and I think this is worth highlighting because of it. It's more important for you to see or to understand what it is. that will happen after you submit your resources in terms of sharing back with you. So once you've submitted your resources, the Digital Archives Assistant here at AT Central, and that's Molly for those of you who may have worked with her before, she receives your submission. She reviews it and decides whether to create a new resource record or to amend an existing one, like we saw in the last flowchart. She'll be the one to contact you with any questions about your submissions. So for example, we talked a little bit earlier about there being copyrighted material in the submission. If Molly sees that, she'll be the one to contact you and try to figure something out. Or if she just needs a little more context in terms of what the materials all are, she'll ask. Molly adds any appropriate notes to your records, and then she also adds minimal data. She's primarily responsible for adding that series and relation data because her job is really integrating this new resource into a larger collection, so she wants to make sure that she establishes all the necessary relationships. When she's ready, she notifies the cataloger here that there is something new for archiving, and the cataloger adds all of that metadata that we just looked at. When that metadata is complete, the Digital Archives Assistant is notified that archiving is complete, and then Molly will be the one, once again, to send you an email that says, we've completed your archiving request. Here are links to all of the materials that we've archived. Please take a look and let us know if you'd like anything changed. And so that's where the submitter becomes the reviewer and looks over the records. If there's anything that you're not entirely happy with, let's say you disagree a little bit with the education level or the audience that we identified, just let us know and we'll go back and edit those records as necessary. So I believe next we have another short break for questions.
I did get another question, Kendra, in private chat. Somebody asked me, how long does it take to archive something?
That's a very good question. It's a very difficult one to answer.
Of course.
Well, it depends largely on what the materials are. So the smaller the collection, the faster it'll get archived. Very, very large collections, because we do receive or have been receiving entire collections from centers. Those will take some time to finish archiving. And we do try to process most of the materials in the order that we receive them. Though, like I said, if it's a small single PDF and we have a very large collection that we're processing simultaneously, we'll process those smaller collections as we go along. And so it could vary widely, hopefully only a few weeks, but Molly will always be in contact, keep you up to date, let you know where you are in the process, and you can also see that on the archive submission page in the table. You'll be able to see where we are in the archiving process.
You know, somebody else just put in chat that they were interested in adapting some other materials they found, other GIS materials, and they were asking, is it okay to just grab those right off of AT Central, or should they contact the individual project that the stuff came from?
That's actually a very timely question, because that's sort of what we're going to talk about next. So in our next few slides, and I'll move forward here in a moment if there's no other questions, we're going to be looking at how to access material in our collection. So far we've been really focused on the process, but I really want to come back to the why we're archiving your materials here at the end of the presentation. And the purpose there, of course, is to ensure that those deliverables remain available and discoverable to others who are interested in your work. And like I said earlier, it's also a great way for you to disseminate your work. So we do maintain information about access rights, and that's whether or not the materials are available under a Creative Commons license. If you come across materials that have a Creative Commons license attached to them or some other license, and it says there that it's freely available, yes, by all means, grab it off of our website and do anything you like with that materials as long as it meets the requirements of the license that is attached to the material. If you come across materials that don't yet have any type of license attached to them or any data indicating whether those materials can be freely adapted and used in your classroom, it's more likely that someone really just hasn't thought about attaching a license than that they don't want you to use the materials. So all of our materials link back to project and center records that will allow you to find the contact name for the PI who created the material. And that will allow you to contact them directly and ask if you can use the material in the way that you want to. If it's not indicated in the record already, that using the material is okay.
I think that's it for our questions, so we can move back in and talk a little bit about how folks can find things in the resource portal now, Kendra, I think.
Okay, so we're just going to look at 3 slides briefly. So these are just very basic examples of how you might go about finding material in our collection by using all of that metadata that our catalogers add to the resource records. Some of our materials are archived, and more archival materials are being added every day, but not necessarily everything is archived. And like I said earlier, not necessarily everything has a Creative Commons license associated with it either. There are, however, thousands of resources, and let's take a few moments just to look at how you might find those resources in case you'd like to use them. So this is a screenshot from the AT Central homepage. I'm logged in under my account, which is evidenced by this little circled, this "you are logged in" box right here. If I were not logged in, the screen would look a little bit different, and rather than an advanced search link here that's circled, it would say sign in instead. So once you're signed in and you access that advanced search link, it will take you to the advanced search page. On the advanced search page, you can search by a variety of fields, including all the fields, like I said, I mentioned a minute ago. These fields can be selected from a drop down here, and then you can just type your search terms in and search the collection in that way. And some of them, some of the values are listed for you, and you can just select amongst the options and conduct a search. So right here circled is the content license field. This is where you'll see all of the CC licenses that have been attributed to works in the collection, and you can use this field to then find materials that you're interested in. Another way to access materials, and probably the way that most people access materials in our collection, is first to conduct a keyword search here in the upper right-hand corner. So you see this little search box, and then it says go. In my example, I typed, you can see right here, the word sustainable resources into that search box and then received this research results page. Once you've conducted that keyword search, you'll see all of these facets here on the left-hand side. And these facets allow you to narrow your search in order to find the material that you're specifically interested in. So I could narrow by education level here, you see, or by format, a variety of other fields. And right here, once again, is that content license field. So I could look specifically for resources that have been licensed to me to use. Finally, I will note this little archived logo here once again. So of the resources that we see here, you can tell that this one has been archived with ATE Central. I should note that we don't yet have that many materials available under the Creative Commons license. The community is only now really starting to think about adding licenses to their work, but I am optimistic that we'll see more of those materials moving forward. And In the meantime, we still have a lot of data that can help you identify materials that you're interested in and that you'd like to use in your classrooms or in some other way. So it looks like we're approaching the hour right now. So we have a final poll question for you, and I'll turn it over again to Rachel.
All right, so we just want to kind of know, now that you're a little bit more familiar with how the archiving process works, which of the following areas do you really feel like you would like a little bit more information on? Preparing materials for archiving, in other words, how you'd format them or how you might name those files that Kendra talked about, the whole licensing and IP issue, or finding more materials for your own use on ATE Central or in other places, or maybe all the above. Ooh, we're getting lots of all the above, which makes me very happy. And of course, if you click on other, we'd love to hear about something else that you're interested in learning more about. We're just getting lots of all the above. Okay. Well, we really try to take this into consideration, and we almost always do something at the PI conference in the fall on archiving. So it's a good way for us to kind of get a handle on what people would like to know about. Kendra usually does some kind of an archiving presentation or panel. The PI conference, Kelly, is in Washington, D.C. It's in October each year, and you can, if you put in ATPI conference, the American Association of Community Colleges holds that conference. You'll be able to find lots of information online. Okay, thanks, Mike. I think that's great. We're right close to the end of our presentation here. Hang in there with us for a few more minutes.
I just wanted to take a moment to highlight that we've done other webinars in the past. Our 2017 webinar was titled Archiving with ATE Central, the Basics, and this really talks about planning to archive and getting your materials ready. It highlights sort of the key questions you could ask yourself during the archiving planning process. The archiving checklist that was attached to today's webinar is really what we go through in that particular presentation in much more detail. So if you're interested in looking at last year's webinar, it's available at atcentral.net/webinars, and I believe it's towards the bottom of that page. And then finally, here's just a few links from our website. /archiving is our main archiving service page. All of these links below are linked to it in some way. We have an archiving guide. A lot of today's screenshots came from that guide. And then we also have the /AR guide. That's actually activity report guide, so it's not related to archiving per se, but we did highlight the activity reports briefly, so we wanted to provide that link. And then I also just added a link to some of the sustainability webinars that Rachael conducts because archiving is very much related to sustainability. And then finally, just a few links about copyright and licensing in general.
And remember, you'll get all of these. We'll be sending out the slides to you. We'll send the archiving checklist again, and we'll send a link to this webinar in a follow-up email that you'll get in the next few days. We really appreciate you guys being with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. And we want to make sure that you take our survey, and Mike is going to put that survey up.
Rachel.
And you may see that open in another window.
I just wanted to let people know that when I click on the survey, it will open another window, but also for some systems, like my Mac occasionally, it won't open. And so I'll paste the link into the chat window as well. So here we go. Here we go, launching that.
Into the chat? Okay, perfect. It should just pop up in chat. Oh, there, it opened for me. And if it didn't open for you, take a look in that chat window. Mike's going to put it right in there. I don't see it yet, Mike. Oh, he's typing. There it is. So if for some reason it didn't open a new window for you, just click on that link that Mike pasted in. We really appreciate you doing this. Obviously, we try to collect our own data about the webinars and learn about what's useful, and what you guys would like to know more about and all that kind of good stuff. We have to do our own evaluation, like all of you do, for AT Central, and this is part of what helps us make these webinars as valuable as possible to you all, and helps inform our next webinars too. So Kendra, any last words or any last questions here while people kind of take the survey? Anybody have any last questions? I didn't see anything.
Thank everyone for attending, and thank you all for the great questions. And I hope that you'll take something useful away from today's webinar.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kendra. You did a great job. Those workflow charts were fabulous. They're really, really good. And you guys can get a chance to kind of look at all of the slides again when we send them out to you along with the recording. Feel free to pass this on to other colleagues if you think there's somebody on your staff or other folks you know who would be interested. We love to get the links passed around to other people.
It is, Rachel. Thank you again to you and Kendra.
Today,
just
Mike.
An excellent presentation today. A lot of interest, a lot of questions. ATE PI community forever, and thank you. That officially ends our webinar today, folks. We'll go on to mute Rachel and Kendra, if you would. I'll leave the system open for a few minutes while people complete that survey, and I'll turn off the recording now. So thank you again, both Kendra and Rachel, and goodbye, everyone.
Okay. Bye, everybody.